Hello, welcome back to the Mind the Gap podcast, a podcast where we specifically talk to people building in the space to improve healthcare for Black and people of color. Today, I'm joined by the wonderful Alice, who works at the Red Cross. Alice, I'd love if you could introduce yourself to the listeners today.
Okay, so I'm Alice Squires. I'm the training product manager with RedCross Training at the British Red Cross. So I've got a background as a first aid trainer, and my responsibility now in my current role is I look after all of the training content and delivery for first aid training within the Red Cross training space.
Cool. And you mentioned that you're part of the Red Cross training development. For those like who maybe have never heard of the Red Cross, like what exactly is the Red Cross?
So the Red Cross is the largest international humanitarian organisation. It's based on voluntary service, and we've got branches in almost every country across the world. Do a lot of humanitarian work, and the work that we do really varies in different countries. So, for example, in some countries, the Red Cross might be involved in the blood transfusion service. Red Cross doesn't do that in this country because we've got a national transfusion service. And it's the same with medical care and healthcare facilities. So, one of the big jobs that we do in this country is we support people with mobility aids. And this is a legacy that's hung on from in the war when we used to provide wheelchairs and things like that to support people who were injured in the war. And we've continued to do that. So that's one of the services that we provide in this country. My role is more in the first aid training space, and across the entire world, we aim to train first aid. In this country, the first aid space is quite regulated, certainly from a workplace perspective. And a lot of my work is around looking after the first aid courses that we train in workplaces. But I do also support colleagues who are in an area that we call community education in this country. So they would go out to vulnerable groups, community groups, schools, young people, and provide training for them, which is kind of it's less technical, it's less regulated. Whereas the training that we do for the workplace, the health and safety executive stipulate what we have to train, what level it has to be, how we assess, and so forth. So in this country, the first aid space is quite well developed, and the Red Cross provides quite a lot. There are also quite a lot of other first aid organisations within this country, and we work jointly with St John Ambulance and with St Andrew's Red Cross to put together the first aid manual, which is the go-to reference certainly in this country for first aid training, and a lot of training organisations and members of the public, you can buy it on Amazon and buy it in your bookshops. The first aid manual, it's available widely, and it's regularly updated. So that's kind of where we're at, really.
Okay, nice. And I've heard a lot about people talking about first aid being regulated, but
Mhm.
I mean, to myself, just hearing that, it's like I struggle to process like what type of regulation would be needed on just first aid training. Could you touch
Yeah.
on like maybe what regulation is
Well,
there?
well, one of the things about first aid is it's a skill we want to train people, but we never want them to use. We don't want people to have accidents. We don't want people to become unwell. And so when somebody learns a new skill to use, in most instances, they'll be using it straight away, won't they? You learn how to use a new system on your computer. The next week, the system's installed and everybody's using it, and you get to use it. But first aid's different than that. When we train you, we want you to feel confident when you walk out of the room and to know what you're doing. But you might not need to put those skills into practice next week, next month, next year. Um, and so there's a requirement for workplace first aiders to come back and retrain every 3 years. So that's one of the regulatory requirements, is that if you've got if you've got first aiders in your workplace, great that they've done some training and got a certificate, but they're going to have to redo that 3 years later and 3 years later, because obviously in your role as a medical student, you're going to learn stuff and then you're going to be using it. But in a workplace first aider, that person is a warehouse worker, they're an office employee, they're a refuse collector. That's their main job. That's what they concentrate on. And the first aid is some background knowledge that they know. But we want them to be able to call on those skills really, really quickly should an emergency occur. So one of the reasons we ask them to come back every 3 years is because they might well have forgotten. Another reason is, as you know, clinical guidance does get updated over time. One example of this was a couple of years ago, the guidance for cooling a burn changed. So we've always said cool a burn with cold running water as quickly as possible and do it for at least 10 minutes. A couple of years ago, the guidance actually altered, and as a result of clinical evidence and research and so forth, the decision was made that we ought to be saying, actually, we need to cool a burn a bit longer than that. So we should be telling people to cool a burn for 20 minutes. So another reason why we like people to come back is so that we can update them on anything that's new. So that's kind of part of the regulation is about the timing of the qualifications. Another part of the regulation is, in this country, we look to the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, and they set out the rules and guidance to keep everybody safe in workplaces. And part of their guidance and regulation is actually people are safer in the workplace if there's a few first aiders around. And actually, the first aider's on holiday, there should be another first aider available. So they set out some guidelines saying that you need to do what's called a first aid needs assessment. It's a little bit like a risk assessment, but you kind of look at what you're doing, the sort of tasks that you're doing, the sort of equipment you're using, the number of employees you've got, those kind of things. And you come up with a suggestion as to what would be appropriate and reasonable in your organisation. So, for example, if it's a childcare nursery, your first aid needs assessment might say, actually, we don't want a lot of adult first aid, but we really do need to have some baby and child first aid. So they would look for first aid training around those particular skills. So the Health and Safety Executive sets out a couple of sort of standard course syllabuses, outlines of what topics would be most appropriate for most workplaces. So that's our regular 1-day course and our 3-day course. But it can come to us and say, actually, we need something slightly different because of the nature of what we do. And part of my role is putting that course together so that it's appropriate and it covers everything that they need to cover. So that's kind of a little hint towards the regulation of first aid in this country, anyway.
Cool. And I think I think sometimes these things you don't actually realize how much almost regulation goes into them behind the scenes. I think on the back of like the things that we're talking about regulation, given that RedCross is an international organization, is that regulation the same, for instance, in a workplace in central London versus a workplace in the middle of South Africa?
No. I do sometimes get an inquiry that comes in saying, oh, somebody's got a first aid certificate from another country. Can they be nominated as our first aider in our organisation in this country? And we can't really say that they would, because we can't credit or be aware of exactly how or what is trained in other countries. Obviously, the Red Cross is an international organisation, and we do have contacts within different countries, and we do try to share our first aid knowledge, and we try to sort of share kind of benchmark suggestions about what's appropriate and the ways that things should be trained. But there are some slight differences, and you probably find that in the medical profession as well, that things are done slightly different in one country compared to another. But there is a global strategy with the Red Cross that we're aiming to get first aid out there into as many places as possible. And so our part of our international strategy, the idea that there would be at least one first aider in every household, in every workplace, and in every school. And as I say, in this country, we're very, very fortunate because schools and workplaces just kind of have to have first aiders anyway. But that's not the case in terms of legislation in other countries around the world. And so it's for our colleagues in the other Red Cross societies internationally to look to their own strategy and to see how they can disseminate that first aid learning, because we know that those initial first aid interventions make such a massive difference. Sometimes people don't even need to go to hospital. Sometimes the outcomes in hospital are so much more positive, just because of what happens in those first 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes before professional help can arrive.
I think this, like, you nicely moved into the next thing that I wanted to talk about. Was I co-authored a book called Mind the Gap, which is a book which has clinical science on Black and brown skin. And
Which I have, and I refer to it. I have it on my desk. I love it.
Thank you so much. And in the process of making Mind the Gap, one of the things that I would refer to is various first aid guides from around the world. And what I would find is that companies or charities such as the Red Cross, which have a massive international presence, would be often the ones who make like a first aid booklet, which is disseminated across Africa, Asia, South America. And in those books, I would often see that like there'll be first aid for a burn, but the guidance would be if you get burnt and you have white skin, even though where these books are going, like the population of people with white skin is probably less than 5%. And I just found that, like, to me, it was almost common sense. Like, if you're going to send something to Africa, like, tailor it to the audience. If you're going to send something to Asia, tailor it to the audience. Now, on the topic of kind of first aid and skin of color, are there any like particular conditions or tips and tricks that you have figured out in your time as training other people that actually, if this condition comes up, we have to do things slightly different because of someone's skin color?
Yeah, well, it's an area that I would admit that we're behind on. You know, we're not doing it as well as we could be doing, which is why I'm kind of reaching out to try and gather some more information, to get some more suggestions. So on the subject of burns, I'll get a query from a trainer saying, "Oh, well, it says in the training notes if the skin's red, blah 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 blah. But what about somebody who's got black skin and the skin isn't red?" So you know that is a challenge in terms of burns from a first aid perspective. Someone's burnt themselves. They know they've burnt themselves because they've touched something hot. They've poured a hot drink over themselves or whatever. So you don't need to look at the color of their skin to know whether they've burnt themselves, because they're screaming, it hurts. And they're telling you, I've just poured a hot drink all over myself. And the treatment is the same regardless of however the burn might look. You're still going to run it under that cold running water for at least 20 minutes to cool the area and to cool into the tissues beneath. And really the more serious burns, they're going to look quite similar. You know, the most serious kind of burn, the skin is burned away. You've got deep tissue damage. It looks hideous. It smells singed and burnt. The person may have even nerve damage that's causing it not to hurt as much as it looks like it should hurt, if you know what I mean. And in that case, yes, definitely we want to cool it. And yes, definitely we want to get medical assistance. In sort of previous iterations, we used to refer to that as a full thickness burn or a 3rd degree burn. which I know are kind of medically terms, and we're kind of trying to move away from being too medical. Third degree doesn't actually mean anything. Whereas if I say the skin's burned away, there's damage to tissue beneath the skin, that's a bad burn. You definitely need medical assistance. That's perhaps a bit more accessible for people. The slightly less bad version is what we used to call the second degree burn or a partial thickness burn, where the skin's damaged and tissue beneath the skin is damaged as well, but the skin is more or less intact. And that's where you get those blisters coming up. And again, regardless of the color of the skin, you're going to have blisters there. The person's going to be complaining. It really hurts. It's really hot. And the treatment is exactly the same. You're still going to run into plenty of cold running water, and you're going to look at the size of the blister to assess, is it just a little tiny blister and it'll probably be all right? Or is it more than, we would normally say more than about 1% of body area. So like the size of the palm of your hand. If you had a blister as big as that, you go, oh, pretty nasty. We better get someone check that out. So again, colour doesn't really come into that. The one where colour does come in is the least serious form of burn, which we used to call a superficial burn, first degree. And in our training notes, in our first aid manual, it's described as a burn that causes redness. So on my skin, that would be, I've poured a cup of coffee, it's splashed on, it's made the skin a bit red, but it's still sore, it hurts. And if you touch it, wow, that feels hot. So the colour isn't the only indicator. You've got history, you've got pain, and you've got heat. And all of those things are going to help indicate that this person's got a burn. And again, the treatment's just the same. You're still going to run it under cold running water. But with that type of burn, you're less likely to need medical assistance. However, if it covers a large area of the body, so we would say around 5% or more in first aid terms, we would say seek medical assistance for that. So again, going with 1% being the palm of your hand, pretty easy to work out. I would say kind of most of your arm burnt is probably worth getting it checked out. And again, on my skin, that would be very, very obvious as a big red area. But on somebody with black or brown skin, it's not so obvious because you can't see that large area. But they can tell you it hurts from their wrist to their shoulder. They can tell you, oh, well, when that hot water machine blew up because it malfunctioned or whatever it was, it splashed all the way down half of my torso or whatever. So you've got that description. You've got those backup pieces of information. And, if you did touch the skin, yes, it would feel fiery, wouldn't it? So I think it's appropriate, I think, to say the skin would be likely to be redder than normal, but to also not just use the skin colour as a single indicator. Talk to the person. And if you're not sure, guidance with a burn for first aid is always, if you're not sure, you probably better get it checked out just to be on the safe side. So that would kind of sort of cover that particular topic, I think, just in my opinion.
Yeah,
Another one.
I think it's very interesting because even at medical school, we always learn how conditions will present. And it's like the color of your skin doesn't necessarily, it's not always the make or break, but sometimes it can be the differential between how quickly someone goes to get seen or how quickly someone deems that condition to be serious. I think a great example of this is like pressure sores. Like studies have shown that pressure sores from patients who have like darker skin are detected a lot later because it doesn't look sore. Whereas like if you had white skin, it would look sore very early because we're using the color to determine if something's sore, as well as
because you
obviously
can see that redness much more clearly against a white skin, can't you? It's just a fact, isn't it? Another one
Yeah.
that we deal with in first aid that causes redness is like insect bites and stings and that kind of thing. And again, by and large, they're not really, really serious. But we do know that sometimes, if you get like I think one of my family members got stung by, I think it must have been like a hornet or something. And it caused a lot of redness and it was really, really sore and the fingers all started swelling up. And I really think we probably want to perhaps pop down to the pharmacy and get somebody to have a look at that and give us a little bit of advice on it. But again, with an insect bite or a sting, like you say, it may delay some of the but it's sore and it's swollen. And if it was on the back of their hand, sort of near their wrist, and the fingers started to go kind of uncomfortable, and all of those are adding into the story, aren't they? But maybe in the wording in our training notes, in our first aid manual, we should be thinking, well, how do we describe the colour of that appropriately so that we are being fully inclusive? I don't
And
know.
do you think those descriptors is that an issue within first aid training, or is it an even bigger issue just
Well, I,
across
I
almost the language of medicine?
yeah, I think it is a bigger story than just first aid. Obviously, first aid is my world. And that's what I consider. I'm responsible for a folder full of training notes, and those are the words the trainers are supposed to use. And that's the whole point with having a sort of standardized training product. And if we're using words like redness, maybe we should be saying redder than normal, or um, redness maybe more visible or less visible depending on skin tone, that kind of thing. But as I say, with something like an insect bite or a sting, you'd know if it was really sore and you needed attention. And the most worrying thing with a bite or sting is obviously a severe allergic reaction where it affects breathing difficulties and that kind of thing. And that's irrelevant to skin color, isn't it? It's when it becomes a breathing issue, like anything in first aid. As soon as it starts affecting somebody's breathing, we start hitting the 3 9s on the phone and getting the emergency help there as quick as possible.
Yeah. And just almost touching on something else as well. One thing that is probably like an issue which is very close to my heart is I think in the UK and in Europe, maybe we're very good at first aid, generally speaking. But I'm natively from Zimbabwe. And like in the UK, if someone was to collapse, the advice would be, oh, look for the defibrillator in the train station, like help them up. Whereas in a country like Zimbabwe, like there's maybe like not as many defibrillators around. Is there like, what is the Red Cross's approach to almost first aid training across the continent of like Africa or even Asia, where resources are not as scarce as they are in the UK?
Yeah, so in this country, we have quite a lot of first aid courses that people have to pay for. And the whole structure of first aid training needs to be quite different in countries where there isn't the resource there and there isn't the regulation behind it. You're a little bit younger than I am, but I do remember a time when defibrillators weren't around everywhere, and there's been a real boom in this country and I think across Europe and the USA as well. And defibrillators are all over the place. It wasn't all that long ago that a defibrillator course was a whole separate course, separate from first aid. But this is one of the things that came in, I think it was about 6 7 years ago off the top of my head. The HSC gathered evidence and decided that we should be including defibrillator training as standard on our first aid courses. And I know there's been some quite high profile publicity campaigns with celebrities and that kind of thing, showing you how simple they are to use, how easy they are to use. And locally, for local groups to fundraise or for organisations to provide defibrillators. It's not insurmountable in this country, but like anything, it's not something that's available across the whole world in every environment. But one of the things that I used to always say when I was training was, don't let yourself get distracted by playing with the equipment. Sometimes once we get a piece of equipment, we forget our person and we start concentrating on getting out the equipment and making sure that works. Whereas actually, the most crucial thing the first aider can do is to get those chest compressions and, if possible, rescue breaths as well going. And that doesn't require any specialised equipment. The most specialised equipment required for CPR is your two hands, and a little bit of confidence and a little bit of understanding about whereabouts you're pressing on the chest, how hard and how fast, and making sure that you're doing that really quickly, because those initial chest compressions in the first few minutes make the difference between whether somebody has oxygen going to their brain or not. And as you know, that's kind of quite important.
Yeah. Could you, we have like a global audience on this podcast. So maybe for people in the UK, this is something they've heard 1,000 times in their workplace, but could you maybe talk through exactly what CPR is, maybe for someone who is listening to this and doesn't even know?
Okay, sure, of course. So CPR stands for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is a bit of a mouthful, and that's why we tend to abbreviate it. What it means basically is that if somebody doesn't respond to you and you try to find out if they're breathing and you find they're not breathing, what you need to do is you need to push down on their heart and squeeze that heart muscle to force the blood to move around their system. And the way we do that is we put the heel of one hand in the center of the chest. As you're doing medical training, you might think I'm a little bit approximate with this, but it works for people to remember between the nipples, middle of the nipples, heel of the hand, middle of the chest. So you're going to put your hand in the middle of the chest. You're going to usually you put your other hand over the top and get those elbows nice and straight. And if you're kneeling next to the person, we tend to assume the person's collapsed on the floor in a public environment. So you'd be kneeling next to them, you'd be putting your hand in the center of the chest, get your elbows nice and straight and get your shoulders so they're right up and over the person. And that way you're leaning in and using your body weight. So the idea is you're going to push down to a depth of about 5 to 6 centimeters, about a third of the depth of their chest. And you're going to release it back up and push down and release and push and release. And the speed that you want to do that is about 100 to 120 beats per minute, which is pretty fast. If you're into your working out and personal training, you'll know there's playlists you can get with tunes that play in that speed. So it's bum, 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 bum. It's pretty fast that you want to get those chest compressions going. The way that I do it is I just count out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if you can't get your words in, you're going too fast. And if you've got elephants in between your words, 1 elephant, 2 elephant, 3, that's too slow. So if you can count out loud, if you've got enough puff in you, because it's pretty strenuous and pretty energetic once you get going. So the idea is that's the cardio part. And that is the really, really key, crucial, most important thing to start straight away. As soon as you know that emergency services are on the way, get that blood moving around that person's system, if possible. And what we tend to say in this country, at least, is if you're willing and able, if you've been trained, or if you've got an idea of what you're doing, it would be great to throw a couple of breaths in between every 30 chest compressions. So the idea for that is that you'd put a hand on the person's forehead, you'd tilt their head back so that you're kind of lifting their chin and opening up their airway. Good idea to pinch the nose, put your mouth right over their mouth, and you just blow about a 1 second breath in. Take your head and face away from theirs for a moment just to let that air exhale. Do another one just the same and get straight back onto those chest compressions again. So that's the pulmonary bit, which refers to the lungs and breathing and getting some oxygen into their system. And there is evidence that just doing that can actually buy some time really vitally for that individual. If you haven't got any fancy equipment, if somebody's not responding and they're not breathing, get your phone out, get it on speakerphone, get your emergency services on the way, get those hands in the middle of the chest, pump hard and fast. And if you're able to do those rescue breaths, great. If you're not willing, if you're not able, if you haven't been trained, if you don't know about it and it's stressing you out, it's still better to do chest compressions than to do nothing at all. It's a little bit of a knack, but it's not technically challenging skill to learn. And I know there are other organisations that train first aid that have got all sorts of little sort of online devices and things in this country. The Resuscitation Council, I've got a little app where you can actually go onto their system and practice on a cushion, just to kind of get the gist of how it feels, that kind of thing. And our first aid app as well shows you videos of people doing it. And one of the things that the Red Cross is rolling out internationally within the next year, I think, is a first aid app that's going to be available internationally. And you'll have all sorts of bits of guidance, and videos are really handy to have a look and get the gist of that.
That's cool. I think it's like a big part of my curiosity throughout this whole conversation that's been first aid in lower resource countries, because in my head it's like in the UK we have like the National Health Service and we have all of this awareness, public awareness campaigns, videos about first aid. But given like my experiences and my time in Zimbabwe, I'm like, there is so many barriers to something as simple as first aid. It's like, even while you were talking about CPR, one of the things that came to mind was just a general understanding of life and death in Zimbabwe. Like, if someone was to collapse on the floor and we deemed them to have stopped breathing, some people might be scared to touch them in the sense that this person is dead. Like, you cannot touch a dead body because of like things such as like witchcraft, all of those other beliefs. So the thing that was running through my head was just, I wonder if there was a world where like people still knew how to do like CPR and everything, but cultural beliefs or like taboos within society just make the outcomes different. So like in the UK, if someone collapsed, someone would go and help. Whereas my time in Zimbabwe, although very limited, it's like if someone collapsed and we genuinely thought they'd stop breathing, I think people would run in the opposite direction most of the time, just out of fear.
Yeah, I think a lot of people find that situation. I mean, cultural taboos and stuff aside, I think a lot of people find that situation really, really challenging to actually step forward and step up and to be the person who does something. But if you don't do something, you're along with everyone else who's doing nothing. And if it's your friend, if it's your family member, if it's someone you've met, wouldn't you want to give them the best chance? And we know outcomes of CPR are not always, it's not 100% positive outcome every time, but you don't know. You don't know about the situation that you're looking at that time. I think it gives people a bit of reassurance to think, well, there is something I could do. I could give it a try, and then I'd know that I've given it a try, and certainly in this country, we would not expect a member of the public to decide whether somebody's dead or not. That certification of death is for a medical professional always. it's not something that a first aider or a member of the public is required to do. So from my perspective, in my training notes, it says unresponsive and not breathing. And that's what that person is to me. It's a person who is unresponsive and not breathing. And if that's the case, then I can do this. I can do those chest compressions. I can attempt those rescue breaths. If possible, I can get a defibrillator. I can get emergency services on the way. And I'll do all of those things because in my world, I can't decide whether a person's dead or not because that's not within my skill set. That's not my responsibility. And I'm actually quite reassured that I don't have that responsibility.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see how like different aspects of healthcare weave into each other. And I think my favorite thing about this conversation has been how the different aspects of something as simple as first aid weaves into the global approach. And one kind of final tradition that we have on this podcast is I always ask people, like, if you could improve healthcare for your community, how would you improve it? And before you answer, could you define to us who your community is?
Well, my world is people who train first aid, people who come up with the guidance, the words for our trainers to go out and share with members of the public, with learners, and so forth. And what I would say is, I don't think that we can improve healthcare without an answer to my question, which is how can we make our first aid content and resources more inclusive and more easy to understand? That's all we want to do. We just want to make what we're training inclusive, sensible, common sense, easy to remember, but at the same time keep it clinically accurate and correct and factual.
Okay, amazing. I think the best approach to that question would be for people listening to this to maybe leave a comment. If you're watching on YouTube,
Definitely.
leave a comment.
Yeah.
If you're listening on Spotify, or just to reach out to us on Instagram or social media with an answer. I would love to give an answer, but I think I will save my answer for next time.
Definitely.
But thank you so much for being a guest today, Alice. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and hopefully somebody listening to this has learned how to do CPR or have learned about the various regulation that exists in the world of first aid. So